Tēnā koutou e haramai nei I tēnei pō. I'm Conal McCarthy, the Director of the Museum and Heritage Studies Program at Victoria University, and we're hosting this event tonight with National Services Te Paerangi here at Te Papa, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming along, and to Charles and Piri for those words, and Ruth, it's really great to see you here. We're going to turn now to introduce our speaker, Robert Janes, who's beaming in from Banff, Alberta in Canada, where the time I have to add, dear listeners, is after midnight. Last year we had the inaugural Michael Volkerling Memorial Lecture here as part of the Museums and Human Rights Conference, and the speaker was Richard Sandell. And Richard and Robert Janes have worked together very closely, and both have an interest in the role of museums as activists in the wider society. So we're absolutely delighted that Robert was able to accept our invitation to speak this year. He's someone that really encapsulates what we try to do in the program, and the kind of ideal that Michael established when he set up the program in the year 2000, and that is to bring together the university and the museum sector, theory and practice, in pursuit of common goals. And Robert Janes is someone that really encapsulates those kinds of integrated ideals. You can see here from his publications and from his impressive CV the kind of work that he's been involved in for decades in Canada, as a museum director, as the editor of an academic journal, as a scholar and a practitioner who has written about management and marketing, about Indigenous issues, about change in museums. And tonight, that's the topic of his talk. The last book you can see there on the list, his Selected Writings, which just came out this year. And he's going to talk to us tonight about the challenges for museums in addressing social and environmental change, and in particular, climate change. So I'd like you all please to welcome, all the way from Banff in Alberta, Robert Janes.
Thank you very much, Conal, for that kind and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be with you in the digital world, although my decision not to travel was a difficult one. I've never been to New Zealand, and I know that I would benefit immeasurably from meeting many of you and experiencing your wonderful country. I was astonished to learn, however, that the carbon footprint for a return flight from my home in Canada to Wellington is 5.66 metric tons. And that flight alone represents about 1/3 of the average Canadian's annual carbon footprint. And that's the reason why I'm not with you this evening. Regrettably, jet travel is no longer about professional or personal desires, because we're in the middle of a global crisis that requires rethinking how we conduct both our professional and our personal lives. Before I begin the lecture, I wish to acknowledge the late Michael Volkerling, his family, friends, and colleagues. Regrettably, I never met Michael, but I know that he would have been a mentor of mine, recognizing his many accomplishments as a preeminent scholar practitioner. I'm truly grateful to be giving this lecture in his honor, and I dedicate it to Michael's memory and to his family. The title of my lecture this evening, Museum Without Borders, a Manifesto, was inspired by Doctors Without Borders, the medical relief organization that responds to public health emergencies. The ultimate context of its work is the world and the relief of human suffering. And Doctors Without Borders exemplifies to me the mindfulness that museums are capable of assuming. I'm not, of course, referring to the provision of medical services, but rather to the ability of museums to assist in the creation of a new, caring, and more conscious future for themselves and their communities. I believe that this can only be done through authentic engagement with contemporary issues and aspirations. And this is the opportunity and responsibility that I want to explore this evening, based on the premise that museums have a broader role to play in society. I also want to examine the deep place of why museums exist and what they mean in terms of identity, community, and civil life. And please note that my use of the word museum is inclusive. It includes art galleries, science museums, heritage sites, and so forth. The idea of borders in my title is also a useful metaphor because borders are simultaneously about limitation and restraint, but they also offer the lure and possibility of discovery, change, and transformation. Borders are the boundaries of fear and inertia that prevent change, yet they also define the frontier of reflection and experimentation. So borders can restrict, but borders can also liberate. Before exploring the idea that museums have a higher calling, I want to note that I've been guided by various assumptions throughout my career, and they pervade all of the work that I do. And because I accept these assumptions without any conclusive proof, I want to make them known now. My first assumption is that museums are potentially one of the freest and most creative work environments in the world, and the scope for creativity and initiative should be about limitless in a well-run museum. There are very few other workplaces that offer more opportunities for thinking and acting in ways that can blend personal satisfaction and growth with organizational goals. Unlike the private sector, museums do not have production goals, and unlike the public sector, museums are not normally forced to administer unpopular government policies. So if one mentally combines this notion of organizational freedom with the assumption that we as human beings are the co-creators of our lives and our organizations, the result is a powerful force called personal agency. And by personal agency, I mean the capacity of individual museum workers, not just their leaders and managers, to take action in the world. Museum workers are as insightful and motivated by issues and aspirations as are any other human beings. Yet they more often than not shy away from expressing their personal agency and values in the museum, perhaps for fear of losing their jobs or losing their friends. But this fear is exaggerated, especially by those in authority. In fact, personal agency should be celebrated and nurtured as a vital resource for an organization and a force for good. My second assumption is that museums are unique and valuable social institutions and have no suitable replacement. Neil Postman, the cultural critic and author, wrote that the purpose of all competent museums is to provide answers to the fundamental question, what does it mean to be a human being? Governments are not equipped to do this. Business is committed to profit, not reflection. And most universities are still grappling with their real and perceived separation from their communities. Museums are distinct from all of these institutions and are uniquely qualified to probe our humanness. And herein lies their great strength and their great worth. My third assumption is that museums should not hold themselves static. And that's a stubborn trait of many museums that has various causes, including the tyranny of collections and the museum's privileged place in society, as well as a certain insularity. To hold a museum static, however, while the values of individuals and communities are changing, is to doom the museum. And now both individual and societal values are in great flux at this time, as the world confronts a litany of socio-environmental issues. So all museums must be intensely mindful of stagnation or change, or assume the attendant risks of decline, irrelevance, or perhaps even collapse. The UK Museums Association, for example, recently warned that local governments there now see museums as expendable. And the association described how public spending cuts have forced institutions to close and put collections at risk, with a detrimental effect on the wider public. All of us should be rightfully disturbed by this alarming news. My fourth and final assumption is that everything that is required to fulfill the potential of museums is here now. There is nothing lacking. From the beginning of my career, there's been an incessant talk of shortage in the museum world, be it money, staff, technology, or public support. And this self-limiting talk continues unabated. But I reject this thinking, as perceived shortages of all kinds have become an overriding excuse for maintaining the status quo in museum practice. Museums already have a boundless capacity to act with intelligence and sensitivity. Money is not required to do this. And all museum workers know intuitively that money is not the measure of their worth. If only museum workers would recognize that they are a privileged group working in organizations whose purpose is their meaning. In addition to these assumptions, I'm inspired by Wendell Berry, the American poet and farmer who recently published a collection of essays entitled Home Economics, wherein he returned to the idea that the root of economics is actually stewardship. The word economics comes from an ancient Greek word which meant the management of a household. Berry's understanding of home economics embraces all of existence and includes the household, the community, and the planet. And similarly, the urgent task for the global museum community is to examine how far it is able to meet the expectation and needs of our planet and its inhabitants. In examining the role and meaning of museums in contemporary society, it's impossible to avoid various far-reaching questions, such as how can museums and museum workers be well used? What is this good use? What's good work? And how can we truly honor the public trust in museums? These questions are difficult indeed, and I hope that by the end of my remarks tonight, I will have at least pointed the way to some useful answers. But remember that understanding does not always mean resolution, and that we must embrace the tension of never being certain and never being done. Neil Postman also wrote that a museum must be an argument with its society, and that a good museum will direct attention to what is difficult and even painful to contemplate. My concern over the past 2 decades is the absence of any arguments coming from the museum community, as no amount of audience research or digital technology will mitigate the positive feedback loops of climate change or the consequences of other critical issues such as social inequality, the marginalization of Aboriginal peoples, and the extinction of the plants and animals upon which we depend. To avoid appearing unduly critical, I want to share some evidence of my concern about the seeming unconsciousness of museums. And the following examples, and there are many more, form a disturbing pattern of unmindful museum practice. First, together with schools and universities, museums have increasingly construed their users to be customers or consumers, not citizens. We do not need more consumers. We need citizens who actively participate in the collective shaping of the institutions of civil society, the social order, and its future. In fact, far too many museums are engaged in relentless commercialization. Second, there's a widespread misunderstanding of the difference between a museum's mission and its purpose. Mission is about what a museum does, its collections, its programs, its exhibitions, while purpose is about why a museum does what it does. And this is a critical distinction that goes unrecognized in nearly all museum mission statements. The why is about individual development, learning, and transformation, and all of these are essential in rethinking the roles and responsibilities of museums. A third concern of mine is the museum community's passivity in the face of intensifying activism. During their 20-year sponsorship of the British Museum, British Petroleum has been linked to various environmental and human rights abuses. And in response to this, a so-called disobedient exhibition was installed at the British Museum without permission. And this exhibition simply asks, why does the British Museum continue to work with this corporate criminal? My concern is that this protest and numerous others have arisen from outside the museum community, not from within it. And a fourth example of my concern is the 2016 annual meeting of the American Alliance of Museums, which is the largest gathering of museum professionals in the world. To help attendees navigate the hundreds of conference sessions, the AAM prepares an overview, and I could not find one reference to climate change in all of the descriptions. As David Mann, one of Australia's leading public intellectuals, recently noted, quote, "An intelligent and observant Martian visiting the Earth and learning of our climate problem would be entitled to believe the human race insane," end quote. My last example of concern is climate change, and it is certainly the largest elephant in the room. We've now passed the milestone level of 440 parts per million of climate warming carbon in the atmosphere for the first time in human existence without even an outcry by the citizenry or the press. The 400 ppm threshold is a dire wake-up call, and our profound challenge now is to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050 in order to forestall the worst impacts of climate disruption. This also means that 80% of the fossil fuels, this also means that 80% of the fossil fuels currently on the corporate books will have to remain in the ground. And judging by the results, we're failing miserably. Based on current trends, 2016 will be the hottest year on record. The previous record was set in 2014 and the one before in 2014. In fact, 15 of the 16 warmest years have occurred in the 21st century. Sir Geoffrey Palmer, a fellow in the Faculty of Law at Victoria University of Wellington, aptly wrote, "If politics is the art of the possible, then the climate change challenge may be testing us beyond the collective means at our disposal." To put a finer point on the consequences of climate change, James Hansen, the renowned climate change scientist, recently concluded that if global temperatures continue to rise, it will lead to runaway ice melt at the poles, multi-meter sea level rise, violent superstorms, all fueled by a shutdown of ocean circulation. And closer to home, all of you know that the Marshall Islands are already disappearing. In the words of Robert Mann again, climate change is a fully global problem. The responsibility rests not only with individuals and communities, but also with international institutions and the practices. Admittedly, taking action is enormously difficult because of at least 7 categories of psychological barriers or dragons of inaction have been identified. And these range from ignorance to uncertainty to denial. And denial is certainly a strong dragon, and I encounter at least 3 forms of denial in talking about museums and climate change with my colleagues. These include existential denial, as in, there's no problem, it's not happening. Or consequential denial, as in, it doesn't really matter, there are more important issues. Or third, fatalistic denial, as in, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. I'm tempted to say that if museums and their workers are not connected to one or more of the urgent socio-environmental issues of our time, and if they are still working with a worldview and organizational model that's largely unchanged from the 1990s, it's time for them to rethink their roles and responsibilities, or share their public resources with the organizations that are connected and engaged with these issues. Now, I fully concede that museums are not intended to solve climate change or any other critical issue, but they are in a position to invent a new future for themselves and their communities. Museums can at least help create an image of a desirable future, which is the essential first step in its realization. In creating this image, I cannot emphasize enough that the sustainability of museums cannot be separated from the sustainability of the biosphere. Yet, I note that 20 pages of Google search did not reveal a single reference to museums responding to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And mitigating climate change is a definitive example of Postman's argument with society, and it's now imperative that we act. But the question persists. Why aren't more museums actively engaged in promoting dialogue, awareness, and solutions to climate change? Well, I'll attempt an answer in what follows. The 2015 meeting of the International Committee for Museum Management included a panel presentation with an alarming title, Dirty Money, Divestment, Ethical Funding, and Trust. Well, we don't use words like dirty in the museum world. We're deferential and we're authoritatively neutral, or so we believe. I want to consider this widespread belief in museum neutrality because I believe it's a major factor in the current diminishment of museums and the most serious obstacle to improving their resiliency and response to change. I'll also introduce a moral imperative with all the sharp opinions that may ensue. I do this because the role of museums in mitigating climate change is no longer about science or ideology or politics. It's about social justice. Museums need to rethink their purpose and values at this point in history and take a stand on climate change, along with concerted action as advocates of both awareness and mitigation. What is the museum community's excuse for this reluctance to address this issue? I suggest that it lies in the claim of neutrality. There's a widely held belief among museum boards and staff that they must protect their neutrality lest they fall prey to trendiness, special interest groups, or bias. The unspoken argument is that museums cannot risk doing anything that might alienate a sponsor or a donor or a supporter, real or potential. I suggest that neutrality is not a foundational principle of museum method, theory, or practice, but rather a result of the museum's privileged position in society. It's a matter of record that museums enjoy a remarkably high level of public trust throughout the world. This, in turn, has fostered a sense of complacency among museum workers, underpinned by the assumption that traditional thinking and practices must account for this privileged status. And this perspective is further bolstered by the many museum executives who may have 25 years of experience, but it's the same year repeated 25 times. Hence, complacency, the absence of continuous learning, and the weight of tradition are persistent factors in the inability or unwillingness to rethink the implications of neutrality. In short, museum complacency has contributed to a dangerously narrow sense of the museum's purpose in the 21st century. Museums are not alone, however, as all of our contemporary institutions are beset by myopia and complacency. These assumptions and traditions have conspired to create a magical belief among museum workers that they may abstain from addressing societal issues and aspirations because museums have unique histories and complex missions which absolve them from greater accountability. You might well be asking right now, why should museum workers part company with the time-honored protection of institutional neutrality? Well, the first reason is that each of us is a sentient being on planet Earth, and each of us has a personal responsibility to confront the reality of climate change and protect the planet upon which we depend. The second reason is that we know as museum workers that education is a core mission, but we must ask what sort of education is appropriate and necessary now. What the world really needs are museums that provide cultural frameworks to identify and challenge the myths and misperceptions that threaten all of us, such as the preposterous notion that continuous economic growth is essential to our well-being. Public dialogue on economic growth in a world of dire environmental constraints is long overdue. There are clearly limits to growth, and museums, as well as all of our public institutions, must now consider just how invasive the reigning model of unlimited economic growth and consumption are and change direction. The third reason for rejecting neutrality is that each of us is part of a family, a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a parent, or a grandparent. Each one of us is part of the web of life, born of a deeper sense of time. And I cannot overstate that museums are unique social institutions because of their deeper sense of time. With this in mind, in the words of ecologist Joanna Macy, how long would we like our family to continue? If the next generation matters to us, and the children born to it do as well, then what about their children and their children's children? I'd now like to broaden the context of my remarks in an effort to provide some comfort for those who may be thinking that the challenges confronting museums are unique. David Loy, a Buddhist scholar, writes that Buddhists in America must become concerned with transforming the ills of the world through ecological action. Buddhism is a conservative force, however, seeking an inner path rather than outward engagement. Loy notes that meditation and the mindfulness movement are allowing practitioners to escape the world and refrain from critical reflection and action. Loy calls this a crisis for Buddhism, and instead he argues Buddhists must respond to the world. The parallel with museums is obvious. With notable exceptions, the museum community is not responding to the world, be it climate change or any other consequences of our ecological crises, such as the destruction of the oceans, species extinction, and the 80% loss of the planet's forest cover. Museums, too, have their own distractions and internal agendas that preclude or discourage responding to the world. It seems that we museum workers are overly careful with our actions and our speech. As crises mount, museums are alarmingly invisible, reluctant to disturb or assert. Raising museum voices in opposition to anything is out of character. Are museum workers simply nice people who are not free or empowered enough to meet our global challenges? I hope not, because being museum workers should not prevent us from being citizens and being responsible for the consequences of our actions and inaction. How then can museum practitioners and academics shift out of neutral in a manner which Buddhists are also challenged to do? We must begin by acknowledging our ecological selves, the wider sense of identity that emerges when one's self-interest includes the natural world. Or put another way, we must embrace the meaning of social ecology, that social and environmental issues are intertwined and they must be considered simultaneously. It's now imperative that all museum workers reconnect with the web of life by exercising their personal and organizational agency. Forging an ecology of museums is long overdue, an ecology that recognizes that a broad web of societal relationships is the only way for museums to sustain themselves. In practice, the museum profession continues to play at the margins of authentic engagement with climate change, apparently unconscious of their obligations to intergenerational equity. And by intergenerational equity, I mean the concept that we as humans hold the biosphere in common with other members of the present generation, as well as other generations past and future. Happily, though, various museum workers are moving beyond the constraints of neutrality, and in the interest of active hope and optimism, I want to give you several examples. The Australian Museum is a leader in climate change awareness and advocacy. Not only does it have an institutional statement recognizing that climate change poses a serious environmental, economic, and social threat to our way of life and to the security of future generations, this museum also offers practical guidance on how to reduce our individual carbon footprint. Te Papa is also paying attention. This museum hosts a program of science talks featuring climate change, ranging from reducing greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand to the interplay between climate change and sea level rise. A third example is a group of passionate environmental and informal science educators who share the goal of raising the bar on conversations about climate change. As part of the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, these educators are working with museum audiences to navigate climate change in a productive way, acknowledging that this issue is both dreary and terrifying. I also want to mention the Jockey Club Museum of Climate Change, which I believe is the first museum actually dedicated to climate change. This museum is a collaboration between the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Yes, it's a horse racing club. Members were concerned about the long-term sustainability of their city in light of climate change. This particular museum champions environmental stewardship and asks visitors to do one thing to reduce their carbon footprint, such as eating less meat or flying less. Last, I offer a personal initiative, the development of a coalition of museum, galleries, and science centers dedicated to promoting climate change awareness and mitigation. I won't go into the details here except to say that this initiative is based on the premise that museum boards and staff may want to get involved in this issue, but they don't know how to proceed. In short, museums are the only organizations with a singular combination of historical consciousness, sense of place, public accessibility, and unprecedented public trust. How then can these precious qualities translate into concrete action? Well, here are 4 possibilities for any kind of museum to consider. And please remember that you don't have to be a science museum or have a natural history collection. Nature and culture are intertwined in all aspects of our lives, and so they should be in all museum programs. Begin by telling stories and educating. Museums tell the stories of the natural and cultural world, so tell your visitors how climate change and disruption came to be. Use visitor studies to understand the best ways to present climate change and instill a spirit of environmental stewardship in your visitors. Telling stories is not enough, however, considering the growing body of psychological research that demonstrates the toll that climate change is taking, including significant negative impacts on individual health and psychological well-being due to an increase in the frequency of climate-related disasters, as well as climate-related changes in the weather and the environment. But museums can help. They are ideally placed to deepen public understanding of climate change and help their communities understand what they need to do to respond and move toward climate solutions. Museums can provide accessible forums to talk about climate change without the pessimism and the fatalism and defeatism. These opportunities have had demonstrated positive effects on people. It's also time that museums offer climate change programs with an edge. We don't offer equal time to creationists, so we shouldn't pretend that we need to provide a so-called balanced perspective on climate change. The evidence is abundantly clear. Human life is the primary cause of climate change. The Royal Ontario Museum notes that museums must be on the cutting edge of the climate change conversation if our increasingly savvy and educated audience is to remain dedicated to our voice. Second, with unbridled consumption as the cause of climate change, it's imperative that we reduce our individual consumption. And museums can readily assist with this task through information, dialogue, and advocacy. Develop exhibitions on climate change to highlight how it impacts visitors personally and instill a sense that they, too, can help with the problem. Form alliances with science museums and environmental advocacy groups to educate visitors on global warming and inspire them to become agents of change. A third initiative is to develop an advocacy policy for your museum to help nurture and strengthen a broader vision in your work. This policy would delineate what issues are important and how your museum will respond when confronted with moral and civic challenges like climate change. A fourth opportunity for museums to consider is the UK Museums Association's Transformers program, subtitled Radical Change in Museums. Participants are challenged to develop new ways of thinking and are supported to engage with experimental ideas, fresh thinking, and new learning from experts and innovators. This program's vision is to offer museum opportunities to become more central to their communities and to respond to the social, political, and economic challenge that confront all of us. Now, these examples clearly demonstrate the essential role that museums can play in addressing climate change. And although this work is outstanding and inspiring, they are isolated initiatives and they are not enough. Climate change awareness and mitigation require nothing less than a global museum movement. There are more than 55,000 museums in 202 countries, and the intellectual capital and resources of the museum world must now be mobilized. And in doing this, we must embrace both high-level climate coordination as well as grassroots efforts. And museums are ideally positioned to serve the latter as public storefronts for climate change awareness and mitigation. Imagine if there were thousands of museums sharing their climate activities and solutions around the world and then linking together. This could indeed make a difference. This mobilization of museum resources, however, must also be anchored in a new story. We all agree that museums exist to tell stories about individuals, about communities, about nations. But who is telling the story of the early 21st century? Well, corporations and governments certainly are, but it's the story of ceaseless economic growth. Their rhetoric is agonizingly familiar and destructive, as author and activist David Korten clearly describes. Consumption means happiness. Economic inequality is unavoidable. Rampant environmental damage is regrettable. Although we all know that this story is corrupt and false, it's the predominant story in our public lives, and it is defining our common future. This story, however, is also destroying the planet upon which we depend. Korten concludes that humanity needs a new story, and I submit that museums also need a new story. We must move beyond the doom economy of industrial growth to the recognition that the connection between individuals, communities, and nature is the key to our well-being. It's incumbent upon all museums to help envision and create this new narrative in tandem with their communities, and then deliver this story using their unique skills, perspectives, and resources. The responsibility of the museum community to foster this new narrative is so plainly obvious that our reluctance to do so pains me. This new narrative must also extend beyond the immediate urgency of climate change to embrace a variety of other issues. Indigenous peoples are still seeking the repatriation of their cultural patrimony in the face of museum intransigence. Corporatism continues its amoral march into the museum boardroom, and the gulf between museum studies and museum practice remains dangerously wide. This last issue should not be overlooked, as there can be no effective museum practice without a dynamic body of method and theory. This knowledge, in turn, must be fully informed and tested by the wisdom and experience of museum practitioners. So this relationship is a symbiotic one, yet thought and action are too often uncoupled in the museum world. What are museums to do? Denial or indifference will be of little use, as citizens and governments around the world are now awakening to the horrors of climate change. Is this growing public awareness an opportunity or the harbinger of irrelevance for museums? Surely it's an untold opportunity, as museums possess an extraordinary constellation of attributes unlike any other civil society organization. For example, museums are grounded in their communities and are expressions of locality. They are a bridge between science and the humanities. They bear witness by assembling evidence and knowledge and making things known. They are seed banks of sustainable living practices that have guided our species for millennia. And as mentioned earlier, museums are one of the freest and most creative work environments in the world. There are no other social organizations able to match this singular combination of historical consciousness, sense of place, and public trust. These gifts must now be put to work in combating the specter of climate change. This will be a painful and arduous task, no doubt, but complacency will exact a much greater price. Again, it's not that museums should be expected to fix climate change or any other issue. Rather, they can provide the knowledge, the experience, and the civility that build the understanding and public dialogue that are essential to progressive civic action. There is great potential to foster civic action because climate change is the result of three interconnected forces: the consumer citizen, the nation state, and the multinational corporation. While the nation state and the corporations are far beyond the reach of museums, museums are the storefront for consumer citizen actions, as mentioned before. And if museums cannot deal constructively and intelligently with the citizenry, I wonder who can. In the words of Science Museum Director Andre Bandelli, there are fewer barriers between activism and science than we might think, and the borders between socially motivated, value-driven activism and the pursuit of scientific knowledge are, in fact, osmotic membranes. As citizens, we can no longer remain unengaged with science. Science has really become part of what it means to be a citizen, to be part of a society. As I approach the end of my remarks, I recall the observation of Canadian philosopher John Ralston Saul, who said that we cannot ignore the fact that the Western world's citizen-based democracy is dependent upon participation, and to participate is to be perfectly permanently uncomfortable, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. Museums must embrace this discomfort and uncertainty in order to become the authentic participants that they are equipped to be, and to make good on this singular combination of historical consciousness, sense of place, and public accessibility. It would seem that our collective reluctance to move beyond the familiar has everything to do with the psychic discomfort that it creates. But allowing this discomfort to limit the vision and purpose of museums at this point in history is disastrous, perhaps spelling the decline or collapse of museums in a world that can no longer afford them. The current preoccupation with neutrality negates a broader vision for museums, and along with it, the opportunity for museums to achieve their true potential. Integrity is the corrective to neutrality, and it may be thought of as simply a fine sense of one's obligations. It's now time that integrity replaces neutrality as the guiding light of museum practice. How museums will achieve this remains to be seen, but we have the history of museums as a source of active hope. Museums have obviously evolved through time, from the elite collections of imperial dominance to educational institutions for the public, and now to the museum as mall, an appendage of consumer society. The museum's next iteration must now be defined, and it must be grounded in providing substantive and sustained public benefit. It's never too late to do this. As Wendell Berry, the American poet-farmer, noted, quote, "If we are serious about these big problems, we have got to see that the solutions begin and end with ourselves. Thus we put an end to our oversimplification," end quote. I'm hoping that museum workers will become serious about the big problems, because we all know what they are, be they climate change, racism, social justice, human migration, and so on. It's time for museums to move beyond their internal preoccupations and create visions and missions that address the big problems and the big questions, such as, why does your museum exist? What changes are you trying to effect? What solutions will you generate? And what are your non-negotiable values? Can we put an end to our oversimplification? Yes, there is a choice. The museum community can embrace an uncertain future by changing how it thinks and works. A new breed of museums grounded in the consciousness of the world around them is urgently needed, and I submit that paying attention to the world is the foundation for museum sustainability. In the spirit of Neil Postman, I encourage each of you to argue with your colleagues and society in support of Indigenous peoples, in support of the environment, in opposition to corporate malfeasance, whatever. The issues and opportunities are legion. A fundamental question, though, as planetary destruction proceeds, is the fate of our social and cultural enterprise. American educator Richard Heinberg asks, will it diminish or wither away along with every last lump of coal, every last tree, and every last ton of tar sands? In turn, I ask, what is the role of museums in charting a path to sustainability that will preserve and use our irreplaceable cultural legacy? Like it or not, I think this question lies at the heart of contemporary museum governance and management. In conclusion, I offer a penetrating quote from the Millennium Project team on the state of the future. Quote, "Humanity may be emerging from small-minded adolescence to planetary adulthood. We've been trying on roles of what it is to be Chinese or French, engineers or artists for thousands of years, isolated in our own narrow beliefs of what we think to be true and right. Now it's time to grow up and become an adult planetary species. The stakes are too high to tolerate business as usual, end quote. Or more bluntly, in the words of Stephen Wilde, the renowned museum scholar practitioner, quote, unless museums can and do play some role relative to the real problems of real people's lives, then what is the point, end quote. Finally, I recall the observation that if your talk was good, the audience won't remember what you said, they will remember what they thought about what you said. So here's hoping that all of you are brimming with thoughts. And thank you very much again for the honor of giving the Michael Volkerling Memorial Lecture.
Bob, thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. The three panellists are now taking their seats on the stage. And these three local people are going to respond briefly to Bob's lecture and ask him a question. So first of all, we have Dr. Dean Peterson, a scientist who's currently head of science at Te Papa and is also involved with Victoria University, where he's been involved with the Callaghan Institute. And then next we're going to have Nina Finnegan, currently at the Air Force Museum in Christchurch, but moving to the Auckland War Memorial Museum, where she's curator of manuscripts. And lastly, we have Associate Professor Dr. Huhana Smith, who's head of the School of Art at Massey University here in Wellington, formerly a curator here at Te Papa, and someone who's been involved with iwi in doing research on environmental issues. So Bob, are you ready for these questions?
I'll give them a try.
Thank you very much. So first up, we've got Dean.
Hi, Robert. Hey, that was really inspiring. I really enjoyed that. I think, I felt quite smug, actually, during the beginning of your talk, because one of the things that we're going through right now here at Te Papa is a big renewal process in natural history, and we're talking about all of these issues. Climate change is one of them, so we've got a number of different segments. We're looking at a number of different environmental issues: sustainable oceans, climate change, active lands, transforming the land, and I'm forgetting one, but I'll come back to it. But your mention about climate change, so I was feeling quite smug because we're going down this trail, and then I was feeling a bit uncomfortable about the advocacy. And the more you talked about it, the more comfortable I got, actually, with where you're going with it. And I think, actually, you mentioned a philosopher in Canada, John Ralston Saul, and I remember a quote from one of his books saying the opposite of good deeds is good intentions. And
Dean, I just missed I missed about the last minute of what you were saying. The sound, John Ralston Saul.
Yeah, so John Ralston Saul quote that I can remember is the opposite of good deeds is good intentions. And I guess I keep that in the back of my head. And when I think about advocacy, I want to ensure that where we're going is based on good science. And I thought your connection with science and advocacy was really well stated too. Okay, my question, that was a long intro. My question is, what's the balance of information versus citizenship, discussion, and action that makes the most sense and impact for museums?
Well, I mean, that is a good question, because I'm not sure if there is a balance, because as I said in my talk, that we can no longer be unengaged with science, and you obviously are totally engaged with science. But having said that, I don't think in order to connect with the public that we need to present all the complexities and nuances of the scientific argument. I mean, it's clear that, what is there, a 97% scientific consensus that climate change is caused by human behavior. And I think knowing that science, there's so many resources out there for museums then to take those resources and, using their magic, create that into accessible, understandable information in order to create awareness, in the citizenry about the real threat of climate change. and I guess, you know, I said it in my talk and I'll say it again. I mean, I think that museums, especially science museums that know the argument and know the consequences of climate change, they have to take a stand. And that doesn't strike me as advocacy at all. This isn't some kind of trendiness. This isn't some kind of special interest group. Bill McKibben just described climate change as World War III, and we're losing. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us not to necessarily worry about balance or advocacy, but stand up and be counted and use the special resources of museums in order to do that. Great. But Dean, I have a question for you though, because you're fully engaged in this, and I hear so often from people that, oh, you know, we can't do that at our museum because climate change is such a sensitive topic, and it may alienate the director or alienate the board of directors or alienate the government department. Presumably you've overcome that, and I'd be interested if you share some of your thinking on that.
Well, a little bit of that was before my time, but I do think that we have a really innovative board. They're interested in pursuing quite difficult topics, and you know, it's exciting times here at Te Papa. So I think we've got their backing, which has made it quite easy for us. I think we have a board that's comprised of a few really good scientists on the board itself, so that's helped also, and I think that's made a difference for our situation.
So governance is really key.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Dean.
Thanks.
We might now go to Nina.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob. You've given us a lot of, I think, very urgent provocations to think about. I'm particularly interested in your thinking around neutrality, and I was really interested to hear your thoughts about neutrality as a symptom of privilege, which I agree with, and it speaks not only to the organisational stagnation that you mentioned, but I think also to the presumed demographic of our staff and our communities. So who exactly is dictating this concept of neutrality, which I guess is whose voices are the loudest. And I think for some, simply being in a museum space is a form of activism, so I think we need to really take that on board. But my question, again, I'm interested in your ideas of neutrality and museums rejecting their traditional stance of authoritative neutrality in this time of accelerated environmental and social change, and how personal staff agency feeds into this. So what does rejecting neutrality actually look like, and how can we as museum professionals affect change, especially if we are at a level of limited policy influence? So how can we move from talk to action and real consequence?
A good question. And before I give it a try, I just want to go back to what you said earlier about, well, first of all, I would say that neutrality is one of the most sacred cows in the museum world. It's probably even more sacred than deaccessioning is. But you alluded to the fact that there might be a relationship between demographics and I guess age and neutrality. Were you saying that? Because that struck me as a very interesting observation.
Yeah, and I think cultural groups as well, you know, whose voice is the loudest is kind of the people who dictate what is neutrality and where is that line kind of drawn in the sand, I guess.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, to me, personal agency is the key to this whole thing, where you bring your values and concerns into the workplace. But of course, that needs to be done constructively, rather than negatively or divisively. And I don't know, I've always appreciated employees who flew under the radar and asked for forgiveness, not approval, especially if they were full of initiative and intelligence and sensitivity and love of their work. I think you have to create a work environment where authority and responsibility is delegated to the most local level where it can be done well, and then you all agree on what the outcome should be, and then let the staff get on with it. But another thing to consider in addition to personal agency is this notion of being an intellectual activist. An intellectual activism is defined as activities which do not necessarily create new knowledge, but they take existing knowledge and they make it more accessible, more understandable, and more useful. So climate change fits right into that notion of intellectual activism. And I think then with that notion too, you can think about this idea of a new story, this idea of maybe developing some approaches in your museum to challenging some of the myths and perceptions that dominate our current societal thinking. I think a third thing you have to bring to bear in addition to personal agency and intellectual activism is the notion of becoming reality-based. I mean, become more visionary, become more involved in the broader world, and confront some of these critical issues that are disturbing all of us. And this means embracing a sense of urgency. And I know that's a big challenge in museums because museums are some of the least urgent organizations that I've ever encountered in my life. What's important in your question is this idea that action is ultimately important. But you know, I honestly believe, although I totally agree with you, the museum world really needs some frank and deep conversations about what we're talking about right now. And I think that that's the prelude to the action that's going to be required. Because without the sort of conversations, these difficult conversations, this raising of awareness, we're not going to be able to get museum boards and staff aligned in the same direction. And I think part of these deep conversations has to include some of those questions I asked earlier, like why is your museum doing what it does? What changes are you trying to affect? What are your non-negotiable values? I think as a staff, as organizations, as provincial, state, regional, international museum associations, we have to start having those conversations just to sort of wake people up. But you go to the typical museum conference, it's never about the why. It's always about what the museum does. Sometimes it's about the how, but there are never any difficult conversations. And I don't think there's going to be any intelligent action until there's more and more of these substantive, awkward, but essential conversations. I don't know if that's getting at what you're thinking about, but...
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks very much, Nina. Huana, kia ora.
Kia ora, Bob. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou hoki ka ki te whānau o Michael Volkerling, ngā mihi nui. Thanks, Robert. A very highly inspiring piece about what museums can do, engaging in difficult conversations that are affecting us all as humans on the planet. And I've just found all your words. I scribbled my mind map of, I think 6 pages or 7 pages of mind map of your kōrero, because I was a senior curator here. I'll just give you a little story and then lead into where I'm at the moment. But I was a senior curator here, and I left that job to do a action research, kaupapa Māori, assessing freshwater decline issues for freshwater systems into the marine on iwi and hapu land, just an hour and 15 minutes north of Wellington. And I did that because I'm an active environmentalist, kaitiaki. I had to do something physically on the ground to kind of return some of the values like the Indigenous knowledge systems or the Mātauranga Māori, or get very active in planting more trees, which I have been doing for the last 20 years. But in saying that, it's not an individual thing, it's a collective thing, so engaging with many peoples to make that happen. Since then, I've got a research project which is adaptation strategies to address climate change impacts on coastal Māori communities. So it's building on those case studies to help enable our people particularly to understand the complexities of the science knowledge, because it is overwhelming, and it's hard to understand, and it can often make people feel disconcerted. But they're already feeling disconcerted or uncomfortable because it's the decline issues we're having in fresh water, but also the environmental decline, biodiversity loss, climate change is having an impact on our human condition. So the things you all raise are like these frank, open, honest, tough arguments or discussions that need to be had, and museums, I've always believed, are the perfect vehicle to do that kind of tough discussion because of the knowledge of the people within the institution, the way they engage, and then with communities, because Te Papa's a really good example of being very inside-outside the museum with its communities. But I suppose when I left, I was just a little frustrated because I wanted to have some hard conversations and maybe have some exhibitions that were about difficult subjects, but it wasn't quite the time. But anyway, that was just a little context for you. Aside from being highly inspired by what you've said, it's given me a lot of hope about the vehicle of museums to do some really cool things. And with Dean being the new science leader at Te Papa, I'm really pleased because there was a lot of people who helped Susan, develop the beginnings, the conceptual ideas, and they were some of the most exciting workshops I've been to. These were specialists from all over the country came to help develop deep conversations about the difficult environmental situations we're in. But anyway, just in relation to your open, honest and frank discussions, what my question to you was before I heard your fantastic talk, but in relation to the climate change action that is taking part in your part of the world, so the things that you're seeing in your part of the world, how have you engaged with the diverse participants, their local or even cultural knowledge of place? And how have you been addressing and getting them to access that complex science information?
Excellent. Well, the short answer is I haven't done it in terms of the sort of diversity that I think you're referring to, and that would be Canada's Aboriginal community. My efforts so far have been directed basically at getting the North American museum community, especially Canada, to try and wake up to the rigors of climate change. And we all know that, at least in Canada and North America, the museum community is not very diverse. So the short answer is that the work that I've been doing has not directly involved Aboriginal peoples in climate change, although I do quite a bit of work with Aboriginal peoples throughout Canada on issues like repatriation. But it's absolutely clear, and you're a demonstration of it, that Indigenous knowledge is essential, both local Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, to cracking this whole nut about climate change. And the Canadian North is a classic example because climate change is now up in there and intensively disrupting the air, the weather patterns, the land and the water. And in fact, it was Inuit hunters on the land who were sort of the harbingers of climate change in the North and were some of the first to document the reality of real climate change in Canada's subarctic and Arctic, based on their local and traditional knowledge in terms of the contemporary context. And in fact, they are really getting their act together in the government of Nunavut, which is the eastern part of the old Northwest Territories, consisting of Inuit people. They now have a center of climate change sponsored by the government. So there's no doubt that all of us, especially in Canada, with the wilderness we still have left, we must listen deeply to the local and traditional knowledge of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But we have a real problem in Canada, and there's no use beating around the bush about it, and that is that, despite whatever popular press you may read about Canada, we have marginalized our Aboriginal people, and we're really heading towards a crisis in our country now because Indigenous peoples throughout Canada have been alerted to climate change now, and they're beginning to feel the consequences. And at the same time, most of our provincial and federal governments are still pushing large oil and gas technology projects. And if you read any Canadian press at all, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that probably within the next half year, there's going to be some real sort of political crises in this country because of these different value systems and this different outlook. But I'd like that question for you. So are you doing this current environmental work now in an environmental organization or as a museum curator or both?
I'm doing it, and I'm the head of School of Art now at Massey University, so I'm working with designers, scientists, archaeoseismologists, like a range of people who geomorphologists, climate change experts, but what I'm trying to do is bring contemporary artists into that mix as well. So artists' sensibilities, designers' sensibility, a range of different people who see and envisage things so that they can show communities in visuals probably we can't solve the problems of climate change per se, but we can certainly visualise the adaptations that need to take place, so that people need to, either engage with the wet, because it's getting wetter on the west coast, particularly of the North Island of New Zealand, or Te Ika Amawi of New Zealand is going to be, the west coast is going to get wetter, and it is getting wetter. And then with all the data and the science data, we've been able to map the changes. So you can see the groundwater inundation, or the, land is becoming waterland. So, I think the way that we've been trying to do is just pull the knowledge together with those minds, so bring all those minds together, but visualise the changes that are happening and what are some of the things ecologically, socially, culturally communities can do to actually shift their economic base. So these are the things that we've been using the exhibition as a method to kind of disseminate that knowledge, and it seems to be working, and it seems to be picking up with the funding agencies. MB's looking at us a little bit more. That's the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment in Wellington, and they fund the National Science Challenges. So they're starting to see that the visual, not just the science data, is really important, so that people can see their sense of self within that place and the changes that are coming their way. And if I can just say, in New Zealand, the changes we're going to see on the West Coast, they're happening now, but in 20 years it's quite dramatic, and in 50 years it's starting to get, it's concerning, and in 100 years we're all gone, but it's our intergenerational responsibility, those future generations. So we already have data, we're already doing visuals, but it's about what kind of vehicle you use, and I'm a firm believer of exhibitions being that vehicle. So that ex-museum person now running an art school, but I'm not running it, we run it as a group, and we run it like an ecosystem, and bringing design, art and science very closely together.
So you're using the School of Art as a vehicle?
Totally, yeah. That's why I probably was brought on board, I think, yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Huhana. Kia ora to our panel. Thank you very much for those questions. Bob, we're going to now turn out to the audience, and I think, Tamara, there's some microphones, aren't there, floating around there. So we're going to see if anyone in the audience has got a question that you would like to ask Bob. Just put your hands up and we can get the microphone to you.
Hi, I'm one of a few people here who I imagine work in a museum that sits at sea level. And that is something I had been thinking about on and off, and thinking, oh, that's a bit of a long-term issue, which it is, but museums are long-term issues as well. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that kind of crystallising problem, that if we were tackling climate change seriously and thinking about very seriously, we would be thinking, our museum is at sea level.
If I understand, your museum is at sea level?
Just above sea level.
Well, do you have a disaster plan written and articulated for the protection of your collection?
We're just getting the microphone back to the...
Sure, we have plans in place, but I guess if you're thinking long term in terms of climate change, that sea level rise is a reality we will have to face at some stage, and it's about how much future investment do we put into those places that are sitting at sea level now, versus what other future investments we might be making to kind of collect the treasure, look after the treasures that we hold and look after the stories that we hold.
Well, in terms of that, is there any talk amongst your colleagues about moving your collections to higher ground? I mean, can it be as simple as that?
No, we haven't had those discussions, I guess. Yeah, I don't know whether the Te Papa's had those discussions. We're at a similar height above the ocean.
Well, is that some form of denial?
Yeah, I think quite possibly it is.
Thanks very much, Tamsin. Any more questions out there?
Thank you very much for your really inspiring presentation and talk. I don't work in a museum, I work in climate change, and I was really inspired by the picture that you painted of the type of museum that you envision, and this is the kind of museum I want to go to. But I was a little bit mystified by your justification that the reason why you could develop such a museum is because of your personal, all of our personal experiences with, being connected to the biosphere, being connected to time and space and place. Would that mean that a police officer should, for example, think about equality, or a tax officer about sea level rise, because they're also connected?
Yes, you've summed it all up. It's an excellent definition of personal agency. Personal agency is applicable to whatever sector you work in, I think, as far as I'm concerned. It's assuming responsibility for the world at large to the extent that you can. So I would say yes to all those examples that you gave. And without that sort of personal, value-driven commitment, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. We're not going to be able to solve these problems, because clearly so many of our organizations now on the societal level are archaic, they're increasingly ineffective, they're tying up far too many resources, and we need much more a personal and individual and community assumption of responsibility, and personal agency is the key to that. So I think it's a universal value.
Sure, Nina, go. Yep.
If you could elaborate a little bit more when you mentioned the tyranny of collections. Just a bit more on that concept.
Well, I mean, collections, of course, are absolutely key, and they're the defining feature of museums. But I say tyranny because I think there's a lot of unthinking behavior that goes along with collections. I mean, I have my own personal examples that have caused me to think that way. I worked in one museum that had a budget of about $15 million Canadian a year, and we were running into financial problems. So we actually did a very thorough audit of the care of our permanent collections. We had about 1.4 million objects, I think. And by the time we costed what it actually required to care for that collection, we were spending $5.5 million, over 1/3 of our annual budget, just to care for that collection. And there was never any more than 4% on exhibition at any particular time. No deaccessioning had been done, because we were getting an object, and once you get an object, you're supposed to keep it forever. And there are all these assumptions that underlie this tyranny, where the collection sort of becomes the tail that's wagging the dog. And really, collections are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. And I think they could be used much more creatively, and there could be a great reduction, at least in Canada, of the redundancy and repetition of collections if more and more museums would sort of divide up the turf rather than trying to be everything to anyone. To everyone, I mean.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. We've got time maybe for one or two more questions. Right up the back there, thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your inspiring lecture. I don't work in a museum setting, but I was wondering if I could ask you a question which is pertinent to New Zealand, but may also be pertinent to Banff. I haven't been to Banff, but I see the beautiful tourist brochures, the wonderful pictures of the Chateau Hotel, Lake Louise, etc. A big part of the New Zealand economy is attracting tourists and tourism to help drive our GDP. And I wondered if you could give any examples in terms of the socio-political advocacy or activities that perhaps your museum in Banff has done in terms of being a little bit radical, a little bit advocacy around issues like tourism, where there is a huge economic drive at a societal level and a socio-political level. Thank you.
I don't think, great question. I don't think I can give any creative examples, because the Banff, and I live in a small former mining town about 5 minutes from Banff, and it's in a place called the Bow Valley, and it has become an international tourism mecca, as you say. And I feel that I live on another planet when I listen to the radio every morning and read the local newspapers about the continuous promotion of tourist visitation here by long-distance aircraft, driving, whatever form of transportation, because long-distance jet travel has now become a major contributor of greenhouse gases, but our political leaders, tourism developers seem completely oblivious to this. And we're getting bigger airports, we're getting more flights into the Bow Valley from China. And I think that it just, unless something is done fairly soon with respect to this, that it's just a recipe for disaster, because all it's doing is exacerbating the climate change problem. And it's ironic now because jet travel is becoming even cheaper and cheaper with cheaper oil. I mean, I would think if we could get to $300 a barrel oil for 6 months, that egalitarian jet travel would simply stop and it would only be available for the elite. And short of that sort of solution, I think we're just going to keep sleepwalking into the future. And I don't think that tourism is contributing anything constructive to the critical issue that we're facing. Sorry to have such a bleak answer.
Thank you very much, Bob. Any last questions out there?
They're frozen.
In that case, just before we thank Bob, there's a few people I'd like to thank before we finish tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. I'd like to thank the panel for your responses and your questions. I'd like to thank Piri Shasha for your consistent support of this lecture over the last couple of years. Piri, kia ora rā. I'd like to thank Ruth and friends for coming along. I'd like to thank Tamara Patton and Victoria Essen from National Services Te Paerangi for helping organise this event. And lastly to you, Bob, for your wonderful lecture, your provocation, your challenge, and your visioning of a new museum model as an activist working towards climate change. Thank you very much for beaming in and giving us this provocation, giving us so much to think about tonight. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate that.